Journalism is not what it used to be, sadly. So I had a really good friend of mine who is leaving the business, and she's going into communications, and it's one of the things we're seeing happening more and more because it's a different world today, and journalism is really taking a hit. Talk a little bit more about this and so many other things. We want to bring in Garry Gilbert. He is a journalism program director and advisor to the Oakland Post over at Oakland University. Always great to have you with us.
Good morning, Ronnie. Good morning, Tyler. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Before we kind of get, before we dive deeper into the topic of journalism, can we just take a moment to talk a little bit about Jane Briggs-Bunting? What a loss to the journalism community with her death.
Jane was an iconic figure, particularly in Michigan journalism, but she was known nationwide. You know, if you knew Jane, she was sassy, she was funny, she was smart. She could be prickly. She could get indignant. Just a huge personality. And her students, through the 25 years that she taught at Oakland University, then another 9 years that she taught at Michigan State University, her students, she felt a strong sense of loyalty to those students, and the students would stay in touch with her for the rest of their careers. They would invite her to their weddings. They would send her pictures of their children. That was the kind of influence that she was on their lives. And yes, Jane died last week due to a rare form of cancer that she had been battling courageously for 7 years. And it's a tremendous loss to journalism, not just in Michigan, but around the United States.
So I so wish that I would have been a recipient of sitting in one of her classes. Media law was one of my favorite classes. In fact, I applied to law school, was going to law school, and then life kind of sidelined me into journalism at that point in time. But she also went on to be a law professor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was working as a reporter at the Detroit Free Press, going to law school at night. That's where she met her husband, Bob Bunting, who was a police officer in Detroit and was going to law school at night. After Jane finished earned her Juris Doctor, her law degree, she came to Oakland University in 1978 to begin teaching. Her law, what was then called Law of the Press class, was notorious for being a rigorous class. In fact, that's where I met Jane. I took that class. I was a graduate student at Oakland, but I thought, well, there's a class. I was actually studying American history, but I thought there's a class I ought to take. I had not taken it as an undergraduate. It was without doubt of any of the graduate or undergraduate courses that I took in my academic career, the most difficult. Jane would assign.
What was your grade?
I got a 3.8. I'm happy to say, although I earned it. Jane would assign hundreds of pages of case law to students, and students always trying to find a way to get around having to do all of that reading. We would get together and we would divide up all the cases, and okay, Rob, you do this case, and I'll do this case, and Sally, you do that case, and then we'll share our notes, so that way we won't have to read all of them. Jane could always figure that out. She always knew, and she would call on you in class and ask you to summarize a case, and she knew which ones that you were prepared to summarize. I don't know how she was able to pull that off, but she could embarrass you on the floor of her classroom. She could humiliate you if you weren't prepared to dive deep into one of her assigned cases. Students feared her, but they respected her. And when you graduated, you knew you were smarter, that you were prepared. And she then became, for most of her students, a lifelong resource.
And it's people that come up through journalism, we so love and respect people such as herself, because they do make us better and they do make us stronger. And with that, Garry Gilbert with us here on the Mega.
Can you imagine, Ronnie, at least on 3 occasions, she filed lawsuits against her employer. against the universities that employed her on behalf of the student newspapers there. Whenever she felt that members of the administration were withholding secrets, were withholding information that she thought the public needed, she was willing to go to bat for it. One of the most famous instances was in 1995, when the university was in searching for a new president, was conducting secret meetings down at Detroit Metro Airport. She sent reporters from the campus newspaper, the Oakland Post, down there to knock on the door. When they were refused, the Board of Trustees refused to admit the reporters to the meeting, she came to me. I was at that time the managing editor of the Oakland Press in Pontiac. I arranged a meeting with Dale Duncan, who was our publisher. Jane said, what the university is doing is a violation of the Open Meetings Act. I've filed the lawsuits against the university before, but I'm hopeful that because this is such an important case that you would be willing to go in with us and file a suit with the understanding that the university is violating the Open Meetings Act. A search for president should be public. Otherwise, how do we know that they're not throwing out all of the female applicants? How do we know that they're not throwing out all of the minority applicants? Dale Duncan was our publisher. He agreed to file a lawsuit. That case went to Judge Gene Schnell's in Oakland Circuit Court. The case decision came down right after the April 19th, 1995 bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. Judge Schnell's actually cited that as an example, said the government must be transparent, and he ordered Oakland University to open up its search. He also ordered Oakland University to pay the newspaper more than $50,000 in legal fees, which we then turned around and we donated that money back to the university with Jane's blessing in order to create a scholarship for journalism students. And we would encourage them to always be willing to challenge authority and to question all assumptions. I think that was the perfect use of that money. And that scholarship still exists at Oakland University, as does a scholarship funded by Jane and her husband, Bob.
What an amazing experience that you were able to have under her leadership, but also under her guidance. But with that, I'm a fierce opponent of or a fierce fighter for FOIA. The Freedom of Information Act, people need to understand this is not for journalism. This is not for lawyers. This is for you, and this is for the citizens. And she was also someone who fought for open government.
Yes.
What would she think about where we are today? And, and where are we today? Like, why are we in the state of Michigan just now still fighting some of these issues about transparency with our state legislators and our governor? At the end of the day, you work for us.
Exactly. Holly, my wife Holly, is also an instructor at Oakland University in the journalism program, and Holly and I were able to stay connected to Jane up until about December of 2020. So we know how Jane felt about these issues. Right after Jane retired as the chair of the School of Journalism at Michigan State University, she retired from Michigan State University, but that gave her an opportunity to do something that she'd always wanted to do, which was to create a nonprofit organization in the state that would help citizens and journalists with FOIA requests and with Open Meetings Act requests. So she founded what's called the Michigan Coalition for Open Government and offered free legal advice to TV and radio stations like yours, to small newspapers, to websites that needed legal help, that needed advice on how to get government officials, city councils, township boards, and by the way, Ronnie, that's where I think you tend to see most often the abuse of open meetings or the refusal to disclose information to reporters and to citizens is at these smaller boards, because frankly, many of the members of the board just aren't familiar with the rules and with the laws. So Jane offered free legal advice, and it was probably every week that we would hear from either a citizen in a place like Sanilac County, or we'd hear from a reporter in a place like Greenville, who would say, public officials in my area are trying to make some deals behind closed doors, and I just think it isn't right. And Jane would explain exactly, here's what you can do, here's what the law says you can do in order to make sure that those public officials are acting in as transparent a manner as possible.
So what's so hard about this right now is while we're old school people, right? Like we love journalism. Sometimes I would put in a FOIA just to put in the FOIA. FOIA the FOIAs. That's my biggest tip to any intern I ever had that came to shadow me or follow me. I was like, FOIA the FOIAs. And but on top of that, we're looking at this new world of journalism, and you're on the front lines of this, where when you have students come in and they're trying to debate, do they go, what is journalism versus being a social media influencer? And for me, like anytime I had an intern with me, if I said, what's a FOIA? And they couldn't answer what a FOIA was, and you were like a senior or junior or senior within a journalism school, I was done with you. I didn't give you much credit. but beyond that, if you could answer that, I was like, oh my God, I'm in with you. What do you want me to do? I could do this for you, this, and this, and this is what you should do as a student person, la, la, la. But how do we balance the world that we're in right now with social media and influencers? And why are we even struggling with that in the journalism world?
It's an excellent question. And I have to tell you that when we reach out to companies that bring our students in as interns, and when we ask companies that are considering hiring our graduates, what do you want our students to know? They say, we want them to be effective writers. We want them to be able to speak professionally, and they must know social media. Nowhere, Ronnie, do they say anything about it would be really good if they understood the rules of FOIA. Well, that's not what they're looking for right now, frankly. We try to make sure that our students are trained in the use of FOIA and open meetings, particularly at the student newspaper where I'm the advisor. That's the place where they're most likely to use it. But yes, it is a different world in journalism right now. Social media influencers are so important. Another issue, of course, that we have going on right now is the widespread distrust of journalists and of the news media. The political divide that we see in this country is reflected in the skewed trust levels of the media. The most recent polling that I saw from Gallup showed that about 75% of Democrats say, the news media is doing a pretty good job. On the other hand, about 12% of Republicans say the news media is doing a pretty good job. So that's another issue too, particularly for our students. There is the dislike, the distrust is so high, particularly for members of one political party, that makes it even more difficult for journalists to do their job, to get people to believe what they're writing is A, important, B, accurate.
So you're listening to 89.3 WBLD Orchard Lake, 88.1 WBFH Bloomfield Hills. And I will say, Professor, when you talk about that, it hurts my heart. It really does hurt it hurt. Because at the end of the day, we're supposed to be the watchdog, and we've stopped being that. Mm-hmm. So that really kind of goes into the next part of the conversation, and to when you're teaching journalists of today, do we have to address that journalism is changing? The print word is gone. It really is going to social media. So how can we capitalize on that? But also, how do we fund and support journalism? Is independent journalism the way to go? But we also know with independent journalism typically comes purse strings with the dollars.
Yes, of course. This is the only country in the world, really, where the news media is funded primarily by advertising dollars. And of course, that leads to some dubious decisions by news directors, by editors, by publishers, because we have to attract an audience for those advertisers. That means we sometimes pander, we sensationalize, we do interesting stories rather than the important stories, rather than the watchdog reporting that you just mentioned that is so critical.
It's all about clickbait today.
Exactly. So we do talk about this we talk about this in our media law class, and we talk about it in ethics. We talk about it in all of our intro to journalism courses so that students understand this. Frankly, I am a big advocate for the idea that news should be unplugged from the corporate world. I would like to see more examples of nonprofit journalism. Here in the state of Michigan, for example, bridgemi.com.
They're amazing.
Is one of my very favorite news sources. I think that because Bridge Michigan doesn't have the same pressure to attract an audience for advertisers, that it is able to do the kinds of important work, the government watchdog work, that is, Bridge to me is the best source for information about the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the best source of information about the state of the vaccination campaigns. There are other examples of nonprofits, of course. Also, for instance, NPR and PBS. Those are also examples of ProPublica is another example of the kind of nonprofit or foundation-supported news organizations that I think are doing a very good job. How are we going to fund? We talk about this in my classes too, because obviously we've got 60, 70 students graduating every year who are going out there and might be looking for a job in journalism. Many of them, like you mentioned, Ronnie, that your friend is leaving journalism and going into strategic communication. And I do encourage our journalism majors to think about careers in public relations, because there's 6 times as many jobs there. Well, we have students every year who graduate who want to tell stories, who think it's important, and are looking for jobs for websites, for TV and radio stations, for more traditional community newspapers. And I worry about how they're going to be able to make a decent living. Yep. We're seeing some evidence that people are, after about a 20-year experiment of giving information away for free online, that many news organizations, for-profit news organizations, are moving towards some type of pay model. Maybe a metered paywall. And we're also seeing evidence that people appear to be willing to pay, a significant portion of the audience is willing to pay for fair, accurate, proprietary news coverage. So that's an encouraging sign. I sometimes joke with my students. I ask them, they'll bring in a cup of Starbucks coffee, and I'll ask, how much did you pay for that cup of bitter coffee? $3.50. I said, well, would you be willing to pay $3.50 each week for access to a quality online news report? And they kind of look at me strangely and say, well, I suppose.
Garry Gilbert with us here on the MegaCast. He's a journalism program director and advisor to the Oakland Post over at Oakland University. And with that, Garry, if I can ask just another minute or so with you, if I'm sitting at home, obviously, for people such as you and I, journalism matters. But if I'm sitting at home, why should I care?
That's a great point, and it's a good question. You're probably aware that ratings are actually down for cable television news right now. Isn't that an interesting phenomenon? I guess it's because, in many ways, Donald Trump was good for the news media. He drove ratings. He's helped sell newspapers. Now with Joe Biden as president, it seems like people are sort of, tuning out. Maybe President Biden is just not as an interesting a person. Yet we know, Ronnie, that quality watchdog news is as important today as ever. And look at the major stories that we have going on in this country right now, including COVID, the vaccination rollout, the hope that people have that we'll be able to return this fall to some sense of a new normalcy. We have the stories like the unfortunate gun the number of gun deaths that have happened in the last 2 weeks, and these are all major stories that people should care about. I think in some instances, some people are just sort of moving away from the news and trying to take a little bit of a break right now, particularly from cable news, because they're just not quite as focused on it as they were when Donald Trump was president, because he was such a lightning rod. People loved to love him or loved to despise him, and he drove ratings.
Well, and sadly, I think that cable news has really been the downfall of journalism, but that's a conversation for another day. But with that, we so appreciate your insight because we need to keep journalism alive, and now more so than ever. Journalism is so important within our communities that we have to figure out a way to fund not press release journalism. Someone who came from a PIO position, I will say you guys make it easy. But on the backside of that, there were so many times I was like, gosh, can I get a reporter that will just dig into this? And so we need good journalism today more so than ever. So Garry Gilbert with us here. He's a journalism program director and advisor for the Oakland Post and the Oakland University. Thank you for your commitment to the industry, but also helping shape the next world of journalism. They're going to need this solid background that you're providing them. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think I'm going to go get an Irish coffee right about now. That segment was fascinating. I just loved it.
Did you? I will say, Garry, the best thing about the show is I learned more in a week on this show than I did in 6 months working on the streets of Detroit. So it really is fascinating, but we love talking to people such as yourself. And when we are talking about fascinating conversations, but also having an impact on our community,